right, so today we're going to talk about research papers. So I know you guys are all working on research papers, so hopefully this will be useful. And the idea here is just to give you a sense of how a paper is put together, whether in terms of reviewing it or writing it. So a paper has the following parts. It's got a title. And usually when you submit a paper to a journal, there's a title page, which would have the name of the article, your name as the author or your list of authors, where they're from, and any grant support that you might have given to the paper. Then there's going to be an abstract, which will be a short summary of the paper, which when the paper gets published, hopefully, will be what people will tend to look at first to see whether it's something they're interested in, of course. There'll be keywords. So keywords are generally words that are connected to your article that will help people search for it in databases. So if you're, for example, looking in PubMed for all articles that do cross-validation and your article has the word cross-validation in the title or the abstract or as a keyword, then it would pick it up. There will then be an introduction to the paper, and I'll go over these in more detail. There'll be a methods section, which will describe what you did to actually do your analysis, the results, which is what you found, discussion, which is what you conclude from it. Then generally you'll include some references. There'll be an acknowledgement of any help you got together with conflicts of interest, and then any appendices that you might want to tack on to make the article more understandable to people. All right, so first let me just talk a little bit about general writing principles, because this is something that I find in general a lot of people have not had a lot of practice in. Even if you're a good writer, you may not have done scientific writing before. And if you've done scientific writing, you might not have done much writing in a writing course. So it's very important, as we've said over and over again, to be able to communicate well. And writing is one of the most important forms of communication. Obviously, an article that you publish is going to be read by a lot of people whom you don't know and who might eventually contact you with some wonderful opportunities. So for example, somebody reads your paper, they really like it, they might invite you to give a talk somewhere. They might invite you to a conference. They might invite you to be on a panel. So there's lots of sort of business even opportunities that you get out of papers. So you want to make sure your papers are well written. So some of the very, very simple things that we can do are to use verbs as much as we can. And we'll be doing more of this probably next semester when we talk a little more about writing in general. But again, I'd urge everybody to practice as much writing as they can. You want to use verbs to add strength. Notice that I've started each one of these bullet points with a verb. Okay, it's an action word. It helps to indicate what should be done. Use the active, not the passive voice. That means say what you did rather than something that was done to you. We analyzed all the samples. Don't say these samples were all analyzed unless you can have to. Because the question is, well, who were they analyzed by? And it just doesn't sound as strong as we analyzed the samples. Keep your tenses consistent. All right, don't switch between the present and the past. This is a really difficult one in research papers. Typically, when you write your introduction, when you're introducing the idea, you might want to write in the past because you're talking about what people have done in the past, but you also might want to write in the present because you're talking about what you want to do. So there is room for using both, but don't mix them up unless it's very clear that you're talking about the present for one thing and the past for another thing. So, for example, methods sections are often written in the past because it describes the methods that you set up previously to do your work. The results might be written in the present because you're presenting them now to the reader. You're saying, see what I'm showing you in Table 1, not see what I did to get Table 1. Keep your sentences short, one idea per sentence. Long sentences are hard to follow, and they can get very confusing. They can start having words that refer to things that you're not aware they're referring to, but that confuse your reader. Make sure that for every paragraph you write, the paragraph is a separate thought in the sense that the first sentence of the paragraph is the topic sentence, and it should introduce what the rest of the paragraph is about. Now I'm going to explain to you how I checked whether my models worked. Now I'm going to describe to you how I fit my models. Now you wouldn't necessarily say it that way, but that's the idea. Vary your sentence structure. Don't always start with the noun. Don't always say, we did this, we did this, we did this. Sometimes say something a little bit differently. Write positively. That's part of writing with verbs. And bravely. Don't be wishy-washy. In other words, don't say, I might have found this. Either you did find it or you didn't find it. If you're wrong, that's okay. It's your statement. Somebody might invalidate it later. But to say, as I see in a lot of discussions, people are very kind of unsure about what they should be concluding. They don't want to step on toes. So they make it sound weak. And the problem with having a weak article is that people will interpret you as a weak writer and a weak person. You don't want to stand behind what you're saying. Okay, so we talked about the past tense. Use the past tense for completed actions and descriptions of other research. So-and-so found that. We find that. What we're finding is in the present, what they found is in the past. And use the present tense for facts and current conclusions. So the sample includes 35% women, right? Because it's the current sample, so it's including what they have. And what your conclusions are, we find that, not we found that necessarily. Although you can go both ways on that, but at the very least be consistent. Okay, now let me get in a little bit to the parts of the paper. All right, so first of all, the title page. The title page is going to have your title. It's going to have your authors and their affiliations, like where they're from. Information for the contact author. The contact author is the person that the journal will be communicating with. It's often the first author. Sometimes it's the last author. If you're a student writing a paper with your advisor, one of you might be the contact author. It might be the advisor if you're planning to move somewhere and you want to make sure that the journal can find you or your co-author. Sometimes it's the person who supported the research. Describe what your funding support is. What grants supported this research? This is really important if you're trying to get grant money because granting agencies want to be credited. They're willing to give you money to do the research, but they want to make sure that that research is credited to their support. So this is really important because then that lets the journal know not only who to credit, but also it addresses issues of conflict of interest. So for example, if you come out with a very controversial article saying that some drug is really bad for people and you don't specify your funding support, then it's unclear whether you have an agenda. Maybe you're working for a rival company and you're just saying that the other company's product is really bad. But if you say that your funding support is from the NIH, then we're more willing to believe, okay, you were funded by government support. You're somewhat a disinterested observer. You want a running title. That's what's going to appear at the top of each page in the journal, usually a shortened form of your title. Your keywords, which will typically be words that are not in the title, not necessarily in the abstract, although they could be, and they oftentimes are general concepts. So for example, if you write a paper which uses machine learning and you want it to be known to the machine learning community, then you'd put machine learning as a keyword. It may not appear anywhere in your title or anywhere in your abstract. In fact, you might, for example, have used a technique like a support vector machine or a classification tree, which is a type of machine learning algorithm. That might be in your abstract, but the idea of machine learning is not. But you want somebody who's doing a general search on machine learning. Let's say you're using machine learning to determine how to treat diabetes. And you would like people who are diabetes researchers who are interested in machine learning to be able to find your article. They can then find it if that's a keyword. And then finally, what's the word count? Because generally journals have limitations on word count, and they want to know how many words are in your article. Okay, next, let's talk about the title. The title is obviously the most important phrase in the whole paper. It's what people are going to remember the paper by. It's what they're going to identify your paper by. So it should summarize the main idea. There are now protocols for doing papers. For example, the consort statement is a statement where people have agreed how to report clinical trials. And in those statements, there oftentimes are mandated words and titles. For example, if you're doing a meta-analysis, the word meta-analysis should be in the title. If you're doing a randomized controlled trial, a randomized controlled trial should be in the title. You want to make sure that if your paper is about treating diabetes, the word diabetes should probably be in the title, unless there is some treatment that is particular to diabetes, which is in the title. You use this to locate the paper in PubMed, in databases like PubMed. So if you're looking in PubMed for all articles that use metformin to treat diabetes, if metformin's in the title, you'll find it very easily. Also, when you're scanning through all the searches that PubMed has found for you, it's a lot easier to be able to locate them if that word's in the title. Right? If it's found metformin because metformin is somewhere in the keywords or the abstract, but the title says some other kind of drug, then it may be confusing as to whether you really want to look at that article. You want to grab the reader's attention, so this would be, this is a title in any situation you're in, whether it's writing a newspaper or a magazine or an advertisement. Grab the reader's attention by the title. It shouldn't be a boring thing. Many readers nowadays get journal lists by RSS feeds. So you might subscribe, for example, to get the articles from Biometrics or from Statistics in Medicine. What you're going to do is you're going to basically get title and author. So that title better be pretty representative of what your work is if you want your readers to be able to read it. If you write an article on simulating propensity scores for count data, and you want readers who are interested in that to look at your paper, then have an article, a title that says something like simulating propensity scores for count data. Not something like an algorithm for looking at whether evidence is generalizable in certain situations. I mean, that's a completely vague title. It doesn't really help you much. Be informative and accurate, but don't have your title be too long. Titles that are really long just become very confusing and lost. You have the running title in the journal, but people aren't even going to remember what your title is. Be specific, be clear, and be concise. That's really the key thing in the title, right? Keywords, as I said, are used for indexing. They're very important these days because databases, there's so many articles being published that you really want your article to be able to make it to the top of the charts. And the way to make it to the top of the charts is to have keywords that will lock in the readers that you want. They should be terms that are important and specific to your work but are not in the title, because the title will always get captured by databases. They should be phrases. They could be phrases. They could be single words, but they're often phrases. If you do bootstrapping, you might put in bootstrap. If you use a propensity score, you might put in propensity score. It doesn't have to be a single word, but it describes a concept. Be specific so that they apply to your paper. Something like machine learning might be a useful topic if that's the kind of audience you want, but it's also a very general term. It's almost like putting in the word regression as a keyword. So, if you really are trying to grab an audience that doesn't know a lot of statistics and for whom regression might be an important concept, then use it. But if you're actually using a negative binomial regression, then say negative binomial regression. You need to attract your readers from it, so think about what you would want if you were looking up the paper. What would you want to find? And so a good way to kind of learn how to do this is just to look at different articles that you're reading and see what keywords people use and see whether you think those are useful or not. Now, journals will oftentimes mandate the number that you can do. They will sometimes say up to 6. So usually it's somewhere between 3 and 10. And you can use indexing terms like MESH, medical subject headings, as a way that PubMed uses to group articles. And so sometimes it's useful to grab one of those headings as your keyword, because then it will automatically get located in the right place. Okay, the abstract. So after the title, the abstract is the next most important thing that you write because it's what people are going to read. If you get an article through an RSS feed or through a database search, or somebody hands you a paper copy, which is increasingly rare these days, what is the first thing you're going to do? You're going to look at the abstract. And the reason you're looking at the abstract is you're trying to decide, is this paper worth my time or not? Do I really want to read this? Is this related to my research? Am I going to understand it? Do I think that this work is something that will help me in my work? So there are two different kinds of abstracts that are used, structured and unstructured. You're probably more familiar with the unstructured. It's just a paragraph of text. It typically is what we have in statistical or technical journals. It describes something about the method that you were doing. If we're developing methods, it might then talk about simulation results or applications and might come to some conclusion. In medical journals, it's much more frequent to have structured abstracts. Structured abstracts have certain categories. For example, there'll be a category that will say background. Background means, what's this about? One sentence usually. The next one might be methods, or it might be subjects enrolled. There might be a term for design of the study. Is this a case control study, a cohort study, a randomized controlled trial? You then might have a section on what are the results, what are the limitations of the work, and what are future areas of research. These are very useful to look at for a couple of reasons. One is that you'll oftentimes have to write them. They're actually much easier to read than an unstructured abstract and easier to find things in, but also because they help you to write unstructured abstracts. You can see like what makes an abstract look really good. And the reason these were set up was because people were not writing good abstracts, and so this was a way to force them to write a good abstract that would be understandable. So it's also useful for text mining and abstract screening. So if you're trying to go through hundreds and hundreds of abstracts and find certain concepts, it's a lot easier if those concepts are laid out in order. For example, if you always have to say it's a randomized controlled trial, if it's a randomized controlled trial, then if you're looking for randomized controlled trials, it's a lot easier to find them. Okay, the abstract will generally have the background, which explains sort of why you're doing this work. For example, many previous investigations have determined that aspirin is an effective pain reliever. Okay, this sort of sets the stage. But now what you're going to go on is you're going to talk about maybe either problems that aspirin has with side effects or maybe some new pain reliever that you've developed. Then there's a question. So what's the question is, so aspirin has been shown to be a very effective pain reliever, but it is not clear if it works equally well in everyone. Or it's not clear if it works well in people who have had a kidney transplant. All right, there's some question out there that you want to know. Then you're going to have your methods. So we set out to investigate this using a case control study of 100 cases with breast cancer who were in a certain area matched with 100 controls with certain analyses. Then what are your results? We found an odds ratio of such and such with such and such a confidence interval, or we looked at a database of 100 people of whom half were men and half were women, or whatever. Then what's your conclusion? We conclude that this medication does not work well or does work well in all situations. And then what's the significance? This could change the way these drugs are administered and could save billions of dollars or something like that. All right. So that's sort of a general overview of an abstract. Now, some guidance. Unless the article is open access, and open access means that the article is available for free to anybody. So there's certain open access journals like PLOS ONE where you can just Google the article and it will pop up and you can just download it for free. But if that's not the case, which is a lot of journals that we look at, for example, Statistics in Medicine is not an open access journal unless the authors make the paper open access by paying a fee. So in that case, the only part of the article that you can look at without either having a library subscription or paying for it is the abstract. Therefore, the abstract is crucial because somebody's not going to go get the article unless they like the abstract. It has to introduce, it has to interest the reader. Okay, a boring abstract, even if you're in the most wonderful paper in the world, if your abstract is boring, nobody's going to look at it. Usually there's a very tight word limit, 200 words, 250 words, 300 words, so you have to be very concise. There's a lot of information you have to get into an abstract. It's a crucial skill not only for papers, but also for lots of other things that are going to be important in your careers. If you submit a paper to a conference, there's an abstract that goes in. That abstract will be used to judge whether your paper should be allowed into the conference, maybe for an oral presentation. If you write a grant, the abstract is what the reviewers will first look at. It's their first impression of it. It's also what the public will look at. If you do some research and you write an abstract that looks really silly, some politician who's looking to cut your funding might use that against you. It needs to summarize the study, as I said, in as concise a way as possible that's informative and complete. It's a very difficult skill to master, but it's a really important one to do. You want to write for the non-specialist to attract a wider audience. Unless you're aiming at a very technical, specific subgroup, don't fill your abstract with all the technical details. There are lots of people who read articles and they don't understand the whole article. They'll oftentimes skip completely over the methods because they don't get them, but they want the message. So make the abstract understandable. And then finally, write it after your article is completed. Once you know what your article is about, that's when you write your abstract. I would suggest following the outline of a structured abstract, at least so you get all the key components in. Omit unnecessary words and condense sentences. This is a really good exercise. Take an abstract that somebody's written and try to cut a quarter of the words out. You'd be surprised how easy it is to do that without losing anything, because people are not very concise writers. What that means, of course, is if you're a concise writer, you can fit a lot more into those 300 words than somebody else can. And that's going to give you a big advantage, because people are going to like your abstract, they're going to get more out of it, and they will choose to read it. Probably have a little bit less on the background. You don't have to describe everything that's been done in the past. Just a couple of sentences, one or two, just to set the scene. Omit less important information. That seems pretty obvious, but you'd be surprised when you read abstracts how much sort of extraneous stuff they have in there that really isn't that important. Use an indicative form for review articles. Review articles are those kind of articles that don't have results and conclusions, but they're reviews of a literature. Like we're looking at all the articles that have studies that have looked at treating diabetes with metformin, and we're going to summarize those. There's no result there. There might actually be a conclusion, but the whole idea of these kinds of articles is that they're like a table of contents, and they're often used in methods papers and talks. So you want to make sure that they outline what the key ideas are. But you're not going to go into a lot of discussion about all subtle details of each study. Okay, now, for the introduction. The introduction is going to have your background and the previous research. So what disease are you studying? What's the general context? So you want to start off with a general context and then get more and more specific. For example, chronic kidney disease is a major problem. And now you get into which kidney disease you're talking about, which treatment you're looking at. What are the current uncertainties in the field? In other words, what don't we know about chronic kidney disease? What are the limitations of the previous work, and what problem are you trying to solve? And be specific, and also be diplomatic. Don't say that previous researchers have just really not understood what they were talking about, and so therefore I'm gonna actually do this. Be specific. What was the previous work? What problem are you trying to solve? And why does it need to be done? What's the purpose of the present study? What's the study hypothesis? What are you actually testing? This guides the reader through the rest of the paper and also helps them answer the question why I should read this. If your hypothesis says something like, I'm going to tell you which drugs to use if you're sick, that's not terribly useful because I don't know what kind of sickness I'm talking about. If I tell you, I'm going to tell you about adverse effects that might occur with a certain well-known class of drugs in a certain area, that's very useful to somebody. And then usually there's a brief statement of the experimental approach. We may be explaining why you did it as a randomized trial or why you did it as an observational study. Keep your introduction short. Remember, all these articles have page limits. You don't want to use half of your word space for an introduction because it's only supposed to talk about what the problem is. Make it interesting. Make it so that somebody would like to read it, doesn't start reading it and gets completely lost and bored and stops reading your article. Provide what's important about the research. How many patients have the disease? What are the costs to society? What would solving this problem accomplish? So I do a lot of work with kidney disease, and a lot of people have kidney disease. And so a lot of articles start off by saying, 1 million people in the United States have kidney disease, of whom, I don't know what the right amount is, but let's say it's 100,000 are on dialysis, which costs $10 billion a year, right? That's now being very specific. You've now told the reader why this is an important problem and what are the costs to society. And now you could say, and if you were to do, I'm proposing the following, and if we were to do the following, we could significantly reduce our healthcare expenditures. And then provide some references in the introduction. So if you're talking about what other people have done, credit them. Don't just summarize what's been done without giving references, for a few reasons. One is it's just honest to give credit to other people when they've done the work. Secondly, it will give your reader a chance to look up those other references if they want to learn a little bit more. And third of all, the people who are reviewing your paper may be these same people who've written these articles. In fact, they often will, because it's usually going to be the expert in that area who's reviewing it. And if they see something they've done uncredited, they're going to give you a poor review. You can almost count on it. All right, now let's move on to the method section. All right, so you got through the introduction. People are still reading our paper. Now, this is going to tell what's the setting of the study and who the subjects are, who's being studied and where and for why. What are the inclusion and exclusion criteria? So we excluded all women who were pregnant. We excluded all people over the age of 70. We included people who had diabetes as measured by an HbA1c level greater than such and such. Or we included everyone with a blood pressure over 140, or who was on blood pressure medication. And then what's the design of the study? What are the interventions you're looking at? What are the outcomes? And how is the study run? So if it's a randomized trial, was there randomization? How did you validate that? Were patients blinded? Were physicians blinded? Was there replication in the study? What kind of follow-up was there? And usually then something, so this is the general design of the study. It's the epidemiologic setting for which your study is based. What are the laboratory methods and materials if that was used? If this was a laboratory study, what did you actually do? How did you collect the data and manage it? And what sort of ethics procedures were put into place? For example, if patient data was used, how did you protect that patient data from being spread around like the Home Depot virus? How is the statistical analysis done? What were the descriptive statistics that you used? What models did you fit? What software did you use? So this is the part that we probably concentrate on most if we're doing a collaborative work. This is the part that we're expected to write. What regression models did we do? How did we choose those models? How did we check them? How did we display them? And what software did we use to do all that? So one thing about the methods is that many readers, particularly in clinical journals, are not going to read these things. Even in the statistical journals. A lot of times the math is very heavy, or in a clinical journal, you're talking about all these fancy statistical models that most doctors don't understand. So it's not really going to be read by most of your audience. However, the reviewers will read it. And in terms of the methods, that statistical, your statisticians will. So it's really important that it's written well because A, you're only going to get your paper accepted if the reviewers like it, and B, if your colleagues think you've done the wrong job, the wrong model, then you're going to lose some credibility. It's also important from the perspective of reproducible research. Reproducible research means research that somebody else could redo if they needed to. If you specify all the methods and all correctly, somebody could have redone that study with the same data. In other words, if I gave you the data set and I've written my methods well enough, you should be able to replicate what I did, at least on the analysis. It's crucial to getting your paper accepted is to write the methods well. You need to link it closely with the results. So if you have a protocol that specifies that you're going to do a whole bunch of things, and you end up not doing a lot of them, you don't need to include those things in the methods. They're in the protocol. Somebody can find your protocol. However, if you said you were going to do something in the protocol and you do something a little bit different, for a reason that's important, you should mention that in the methods. For example, you might have intended to do 10,000 bootstraps of something, but you ended up only doing 500 because it took too long. So you might say, we did 500 bootstraps, more were not possible because of computing restrictions. Or let's say you did a simulation and a few of the times the simulation didn't converge. You'll need to say there, I did 1,000 simulations, but only 998 of them converged, and what did I do with those other 2? For clinical trials, the clinical trials protocols are available on the clinicaltrials.gov website at NIH. So those are very useful for you as a reader and as a reviewer to know whether the people who are reporting the article actually did what they were supposed to do or whether they changed the rules of the game as they went along. Now, a lot of times the methods are going to be very detailed. You might have a lot of data collection forms. You might have a lot of advanced statistical models that are hard to describe, and those can go into an appendix, which is usually an online supplement these days. Okay, let's move to the results. So you first one you talk about is your data collection and your flow chart. Your flow chart describes how you got the sample that you got. If it's a clinical trial, it'll talk about how many people you screened to get in the trial, how many were evaluated at baseline, how many were randomized, how many actually did the intervention, how many actually were eventually analyzed. You want to talk about, have a table which will provide descriptive statistics. So this gives the reader a sense of who's actually being studied here. How old are these people? How many of them are men? How many of them have had heart attacks before or whatever? You then want to analyze your main hypothesis. If your main hypothesis is that some drug works better than some other, then there's probably some statistic that you're using to report that on. Then you want to talk about any sub-analyses you did. So for example, did I look at interaction tests? Did I look at regression analyses? Did I do some sensitivity analysis to see what would happen if I changed this prior distribution or so forth? What tables and figures you include are most important because first of all, they're going to be restricted in most journals to a certain number. But secondly, they can include an awful lot of information that then doesn't have to go in your text, which then doesn't count against your word limit. So try not to, and you've got supplementary material as well, but try not to repeat in the text what's in the table or figure. If you have a table which describes the averages of all the key variables, and it says, for example, that the average age of people in the study was 53 and there were 42% women, you might describe a couple of those in the text, but don't go through the whole table because it's just repetitive. And it's a lot simpler to see it in a figure than in the text. The other thing is that it's important that your figure legends and your table captions be written very well so that people can just look at them and don't have to bother with the text, because a lot of people will just look at the figures and tables directly. So put as much material as you can into the figures and tables. It saves you a lot of text. It's easier to follow, and creative figures can oftentimes display several messages. So multidimensional figures that describe several different dimensions of a project are very useful. idea being that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Distinguish between the data and the results. The data are what you collect. The results are what you find from the data. Okay? You might have collected data on 1,000 people. The results are how you manipulated that data to fit models and so forth. Make sure that you interpret your results for the reader. Don't just don't show them a table of coefficients or an odds ratio. Tell them what it means. The odds ratio was 2.25. This means that people in the treatment group, their odds of being better were 125% better. Provide checks of your assumptions. So if you used a model and in your model you made some assumption, try to at least describe in the text how you check those assumptions. Now it might be that in your methods you just say we checked our models by looking at residual diagnostics and outliers and influence points, and then maybe the results just says that the models satisfied the model checks. That's probably okay. If you do find some weird things going on with sensitivity analyses, you might want to put those in an appendix. Don't introduce your discussion into your results. The results are just the facts. Okay? It's what happened in the study. It's not why it happened. It's not what could have happened. It's not what I expected to happen or what I didn't expect to happen. It's what happened. I found this. I found that people in this study tended to die more frequently than I expected to. Well, that's not what you'd put. You'd put the death rate in this study was 12%. In the discussion, you could say 12% is higher than the rate that others have found. But you don't put that in the results section. Don't omit results you don't understand, meaning that don't make sense to you, or suppress those that go against your hypothesis. Just because you were expecting to find one thing doesn't mean you don't report it. Or just because you expected to find some interaction and you didn't find it, you don't report it. Because what happens then is that when somebody tries to synthesize all the data, they get the wrong answer. And it's usually a good idea to report in the past tense because it's what happened. If it's present, if you're talking about what a current figure shows, this figure shows this, that's okay to talk about present tense. But if you say we found that, then use the past tense. Now, the discussion. The introduction moves from the general to the specific. The discussion moves from the specific to the general. The idea here is you want to start off by being specific about what you found, and then you want to make it more and more general to try to abstract from what you found to what other people might find. So first, state your key findings. We found that aspirin was a better treatment than massage therapy for pain. Draw your conclusions about the problem that you stated in the introduction. You want to wrap this together. So if you stated in your introduction that what you were studying was A, then you want to talk about A in your discussion section. Explain how you reached the conclusion and give your supporting evidence. We found that aspirin was a better treatment. It reduced the odds by 50% in people in this study who included everyone under the age of 70 or whatever. And then interpret your findings. What does it mean? What does your finding mean? Is it generalizable to a larger population? Does it mean that this treatment should now replace another treatment? Or does it mean, if it's a methods article, does it mean that people should now use this method instead of the previous method? When should they use it? Maybe this method is useful when we have large data sets, but not when we have small data sets, or whatever. Compare and contrast your work with related work, differentiating yours from theirs. I used a propensity score, but my propensity score had the following differences from what other people have done. What are the strengths and limitations of your study? The strengths of my study was, if it's a clinical study, was that I included a large representative sample, and I analyzed them with sophisticated models, and I didn't have much dropout in my study. And then what are the limitations? and particularly what are the limitations with respect to generalizability. So I didn't include pregnant women, or I didn't include children, or whatever. So therefore, this is not generalizable to those groups. You want to talk about unexpected findings. So if you found some interaction you weren't expecting to find, or you found that there were certain people that didn't seem to benefit from the drug, or you found a lot of more dropouts than you expected, you're going to put forth the hypothesis as to why you think that's happening, and then what are the suggestions for future or further work, right? So what should we be looking at in the future to be able to solve these problems that we found in this study? Then summarize what you found and give the significance and the implications and any applications you think the work might have. You want to address it to the proper audience. So there's a lot of different audiences for a paper. So if it's a methodological paper, you're going to be addressing it to technical experts. If it's a basic science paper, you'll be giving it to laboratory scientists. If it's a clinical paper, you're going to be addressing it to doctors. Your methods could be written very differently, and so could your results, depending on those audiences, but particularly your discussion. If it's a clinical paper, the discussion is going to be clinical. If it's a methodological paper, the methodology is going to be the main focus. Don't report results in your discussion that you haven't reported in your results section. This is not the place to say, and by the way, the people in the study who signed up at the beginning happen to do better than the people who signed up at the end. Discuss findings that do not support your hypotheses, all right? That can sometimes be as important as the findings that do support your hypotheses. So I expected to find this, but I found something else. That also helps people later on if they redo your study and they find the same thing. Discuss findings that vary across subgroups. Did this thing do better in men than in women? Did it do better in older people than younger people? If your results differ from what other people have found, try to explain why. We found a different size effect, but we think it's because we included a subgroup that they didn't include. Or we were using a different measuring instrument. Or our study was done more recently and things have changed. Write confidently but not arrogantly. Don't say that other people just didn't know what they were doing, but don't be weaselly about it either. Don't say, I think it might mean this. Just say what you think, what it means to you. This means such and such. You might need to qualify it a little bit, but you don't want to appear weak. And obviously, don't be dismissive of others' work. They may be reviewing you in the future. Okay, references. So you've now finished your paper. You need to now make a reference list, a bibliography of everything, the work that you've cited. Try not to have a gazillion references. Journals don't like that. It adds to the page count. Sometimes they even have limits on that. Cite the primary sources if possible, unless the topic is well known enough that you can use a textbook. Good example is something like Cox regression. When Cox regression was used for the first 20 or so years, people always cited David Cox's article. Nowadays, people tend to cite textbooks where Cox regression is described. When propensity scores came out, people always cited Don Rubin's work. Now they're citing other people's work, or they may be citing a textbook. This is a little bit controversial because some people say always use a textbook because it's easier to find. Other people say you should give credit to the original authors. But a lot of times, things have changed since the original paper was written, and so it's best to cite what you've actually looked at. Verify how accurate your references are. There's nothing more annoying than reading a paper, finding a reference, trying to find the paper, and realizing that the author put down the wrong journal name, or the wrong year of publication, or the first author's name is misspelled and you can't find the paper, or it takes you a long time to do so. And verify that the reference list matches the citation in the text. You'd be surprised at how often that doesn't happen. The other thing I would mention is make sure that your references are actually things that you've looked at. A lot of times people cite things and they've never really looked at the paper, and so they may actually come up with they may be citing something for the wrong reason, which actually reflects badly on them, but also, think about it, reflects badly on the author. So think about, you've written a paper and you've made some statement, and now somebody later on claims that you did something else. That's not something you want to have happen. There's two main styles for references. One's called the Harvard style, one's called the Vancouver style. The Harvard style is used in journals like JASA. The idea is you put in the text the author and date of the paper. Like you'll say, propensity scores have been shown to be, parentheses, Stewart, comma, 2009. Okay, refers to a paper by Liz Stewart that was written in 2009. And the references are then alphabetized at the back. The other style is used by articles by journals like Statistics and Medicine, the Vancouver style. You put numbers in the text. It'll say, like, this is reference 2, this is reference 3. So the references are numerical, usually in order in which they appear at the back. The advantage of the Harvard style is when you're reading the article, it's very easy to therefore figure out what that reference is without having to look it up. But it takes a little bit more space as well. It's always important to acknowledge who helped you in the work. Colleagues who helped but are not authors. They may have given you comments or provided suggestions. Any technical support, if somebody helped you type it up or compile references. Certainly the financial support, what grants supported your work, what contracts, what materials. Get permission to acknowledge anything like figures that you're grabbing from some other place, or if you've used somebody else's work. And journals will usually nowadays require some kind of a conflict of interest statement that says that this work was done without the support of people who might have an interest in the work. When you submit the journal, you're going to submit the paper, you're going to submit it to one journal following the instructions of the authors, which will usually specify what size font to use, the margins, the number of tables and figures, the word count. You'll send a cover letter to the editor explaining why the research is novel and why it belongs in that journal. Usually the cover letter can briefly summarize the findings, describe features such as prior work, and talk about the ethics and the consent, and you might even suggest reviewer names and context if they allow that. The review process is a long one. Different journals do it in different ways. Some journals, particularly technical journals, will take months and months to get back to you. Clinical journals will typically come back to you within a month. Usually what happens is the article goes to the journal submission process. It gets sent to an editor who handles it. The editor will then look at it maybe quickly and see whether it should be sent out for review. Maybe it's completely off target for the journal. We'll then send it to an associate editor. The associate editor is basically responsible for the review. The associate editor will choose reviewers. These may be reviewers you suggested. It may be people that you've referenced in the bibliography. It may be people that the associate editor knows well in that field. The reviewers are then given the paper. There's a deadline. They're usually given a month or 2 months or 2 weeks or whatever for submitting a review. They're often late with these because they are busy people and they don't necessarily have time to read your paper. But hopefully they'll get back to you. If you're an associate editor, you may have to nag them a bit. Please get me my review back. The associate editor then gets the reviews. Usually there's 2, maybe 3, maybe even 4. Summarizes them all together and makes comments and recommendation to the editor, like this paper should be published or this paper shouldn't be published. The editor will then inform the author of the decision, which is usually to either accept it with no more revisions, to revise it, either major or minor revisions. A conditional reject, which is oftentimes a revision. It says, we are sorry, we cannot accept this paper in its current form. However, if you would like to make some changes, we are willing to reconsider it. That's not a rejection. It's the way a lot of journals just basically indicate a revision. Or an outright rejection. We're sorry, this journal gets a lot of submissions. We can't publish everything. Thank you for your interest. Good luck somewhere else. The authors then revise and either resubmit or submit elsewhere. If you're going to do this, please respond to all comments point by point and include that in your cover letter. So say, every point that a reviewer's made, put it down and then put your response to it. The reviewer says, this sentence is not clear. We thank the reviewer for that. We've clarified this sentence as so. And then if you're accepted, you'll get your proofs that'll come from the journal. You then carefully look those over, make sure those proofs have the correct figures, tables, wordings, punctuation, whatever, and then you're off. You can usually make small corrections at that point. One thing I'd add to this is if you do get rejected and you send your article to another journal, Don't send it off without making the corrections that the reviewers have suggested, and I'll tell you why. Because it's very likely that the reviewer at the next journal might be the reviewer at your previous journal. Because if it's a small field, they're the experts and they're going to be asked. And there's nothing more annoying, I can tell you this from experience, than getting an article from a journal to review that you've already reviewed in another journal, and you look at it and you say, I made all these comments before and they never addressed them. That's sort of an instant reject again. And so you're just shooting yourself in the foot by doing that. Okay, that's all. Any questions? All right. Well, hopefully with you guys we'll get this worked out since we're writing together, but we'll see what other people think. Okay. Thank you.